My name is Guylaine Fermot. I serve as Associate Professor of Art at the Texas Tech University School of Art. It is my great privilege to welcome to the stage Dr. Lawrence Schoovenek, President of Texas Tech University. Dr. Schoovenek holds a doctorate in mathematics from Indiana University and is published primarily in the areas of biomechanical and physiological control systems and solid mechanics. Throughout his tenure at Texas Tech, Dr. Schoovenek has emphasized the importance of student success, teaching excellence, and scholarship support. We are so very grateful to have him join us this morning to set into motion this rich program of scholarly, artistic, and pedagogical exchange. Let's welcome him.
Good morning. I really am pleased to welcome you on behalf of Texas Tech to this inaugural Texas Painting Symposium. I received correspondence last spring asking to speak at this, I believe, in April. This is our lives. These are the things we've dealt with. But I think it's really wonderful that people have the option of participating in this in person and also through virtual means. As we deal with the challenges of the pandemic, I think we've seen how COVID has shed light on our political systems, our economic systems, and our social fabric. I think we all recognize that the pandemic has disproportionately affected people of color, those who do not earn a good wage. And we've seen how disease can be politicized. And also, we've seen the great impact of COVID on mental health. Just yesterday, I recorded a video, and there will be a letter distributed to the university community in the near future. We're starting a campaign called It's Beyond Okay. And it's a message to our students to seek out the resources we have that can assist them as they deal with issues of mental health and wellness, and we need to do, and we will be doing more of that for faculty and staff. But I think in light of all of these issues, this is a very special time to value the arts. I do believe that arts create wellness in our lives. On an individual basis, whether you're buying a piece, or when you get together collectively like this. It's a way to express how we see the world, always, but especially in these times. So, Professor Fermot, I thank you for doing this, to your colleagues. I thank you for what you do on a daily basis, but especially as we deal with these special challenges. It's important. The College of Visual and Performing Arts and all the creative activities within that college are very important, not only to the university, but to this community. It's an essential resource in attracting faculty and attracting students, enhancing the quality of our lives. And I've always maintained that the very name of our university is somewhat of a misnomer, Texas Tech. The largest college is Arts and Sciences, and even though there are a bit over 1,000 students in the College of Visual and Performing Arts, it has a profound impact on the quality of life. So I thank you for how you contribute to that quality of life. For those who are here from afar, I hope you have a great time in Lubbock. If you really want to know what Lubbock's like, you need to read an essay by Molly Ivins. I don't know if any of you would have known who Molly Ivins was, but she was a wonderful columnist. She made a living making fun of politicians in Texas, which is a very easy thing to do. This is not being recorded, is it? And she once wrote an essay. She was asked to write out what's her favorite city, and she said Lubbock. And the essay was titled, Lubbock, Seat of Rebellion. And she said Lubbock, like Popeye the Sailor, is what it is. But there's a lot more here than people would ever anticipate, and the arts are a big part of that. I understand our keynote speaker is from, Dr. Herron is from the University of Houston. I will be going there later today for an event that's not related to the arts. We play them in football tomorrow. All of these things do matter. So thank you so much, Guy. Thank you for doing this.
Many sincere thanks to President Schoovenek. It is such a gift to have had you introduce us today, and it is a gift to be able to assemble this community of researchers and makers who have heretofore had no such meeting place. Your support has made this happen for us, so thank you so much. So welcome again. Again, my name is Guy. Most of you have suffered a seemingly relentless torrent of emails from me for at least like 2 years, if not more. When the planning of this event first began, a precedent was set by Professor Joe Pena at the Texas A&M University in Corpus Christi, where he assembled a small sort of cadre of painters a few years ago. And this event is really modeled on that, and we just tried to scale it up. So we're grateful to Joe for his work, the generative work that he did. I'm really delighted and overcome that we have at last arrived at doing this quite a bit later than we expected. And I'm so pleased that we've come together to take part in this important forum on painting, its history in this region, the artistic, intellectual, sensory, social, and political dimensions of this work, and the contemporary investigations being undertaken in this field. Before we proceed, in an ongoing effort to cultivate dialogue and awareness about the complex, traumatic, and often violent truths of our history, we acknowledge the sacred grounds on which we're standing today. These are the traditional homelands of the Apache tribe of Oklahoma, the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, the Comanche Nation, the Jicarilla Apache Nation, the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma, and the Mescalero Apache tribe of the Mescalero Reservation. We honor their elders and community members, past and present. If you are interested in looking into the broader context of truth, historical awareness, and empathy that informs this acknowledgement, we recommend that you turn to the following websites: native-land.ca, comanchenation.com, and the website of the U.S. Department of Art and Culture, usdac.us. The Texas Painting Symposium has received support in part from a grant from the City of Lubbock, as recommended by Civic Lubbock Incorporated. Additional support comes from the Riley T. and John F. Lott Endowment for Excellence in the Visual Arts, which is administered through the School of Art. Landmark Arts support comes from a generous grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, Inc. of Lubbock, and Texas Tech Cultural Activities fees administered through the J.T. and Margaret Talkington College of Visual and Performing Arts. At this time, it's my great pleasure to welcome to the stage Dr. Kevin Chua, TTU School of Art, Associate Professor of Art History. Dr. Chua will introduce our first speaker, keynote, Dr. Natalie Herron, who joins us today on Zoom.
Greetings. Natalie Herron is a scholar and critic of modern and contemporary art history and theory. She's author of Fluxus Forms, Scores Multiples, and The Eternal Network from the University of Chicago Press, and Carl Handel, Knight's Heritage. A regular contributor to art forums since 2009, her writing has engaged the work of Jackson Pollock, Robert Motherwell, Jasper Johns, Vern Blossom, Matt Mulligan, Urs Fischer, Dave Muller, Stephen Lapis-Fufan, Katrina Moorhead, and Jamal Cyrus, among many other artists whose practices push at the limits of painting. Herron holds a PhD in art history from UCLA and currently serves as Associate Professor of Art History at the University of Houston School of Art. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Natalie Herron.
Hi, everyone. Can I get some confirmation that you all can hear me? Yes. Yes. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Well, first of all, I want to extend my thanks to Guy and to the other organizers of this important convening, as well as to Dr. Kevin Chua, who extended the initial invitation for me to speak to you all today, and I truly regret that I cannot be there to hear from and learn from the rest of you and to see the exhibitions that have been organized for the occasion. I think the discourse that you all have self-organized here is vital for everyone involved in the practice of painting in Texas right now, including, of course, for the hundreds of students that many of you teach on an ongoing basis. And for that reason, it is perhaps better if there is ultimately one fewer art historian or critic in the room during your future sessions. So when I was asked to give this talk today, I was honored and excited for the chance to reflect on the state of painting in Texas, where I have lived off and on for over a decade now, studying and now teaching the history and theory of modern and contemporary art. Originally from Minnesota, I first came to Texas to study art history at Rice as an undergraduate, and then lived in Los Angeles for 10 years while completing a PhD at UCLA and developing my practice as a critic and occasional curator. And then I returned to Houston in 2015 to take up a faculty position at the University of Houston School of Art. So I've done some time here, and having recently earned tenure at UH, it may be that I will become a Texas lifer, like many of you. So mine is a trajectory of coming and coming back with a certain amount of ambivalence, I must admit, that is probably similar to many of yours. And let's see, there we go. At the same time, I was a bit perplexed as to why I would be tapped to speak authoritatively about painting in Texas today. My expertise is in experimental intermediate practices, the post-war neo-avant-gardes, conceptual art, performance, artist books, sound art, provisional notations, and drawings. I just published a book on the Fluxus Collective, and I'm currently launching a new research project on experimental drawing practices of the 1960s and 70s. To be brutally frank, my training, only one generation removed from the mentorship of Rosalind Krauss and Benjamin Buchloh, overtly sidelined much of contemporary painting. It was as if after Duchamp and Picabia, who were themselves engaged in the Dada project of attacking painterly traditions, no painting was worth mention or study until the arrival of the highly conceptual, so-called networked painting practices of artists like Martin Kippenberger, Stephen Prina, Amy Silman, Wade Guyton, R.H. Quaitman, or Jutta Kutter. Unless, of course, one was on the attack, as that generation of art historians was in the 1980s against the encroachments of neo-expressionist painting's seemingly neoconservative version of postmodernism. And yet, despite the dismissive attitude toward painting of many of my intellectual mentors, when I look back on the last 10 or so years of my historical and critical writing, the work of many painters has indeed passed through my mind and my pen, either because their practices push at the limits of painting to touch upon the kinds of practices that were my central focus, or their subject matter or formal means were too compelling to ignore. The last chapter I added to my Fluxus book was, to my surprise even, an investigation of Fluxus's relation to modernist painting, in which I offered a rereading of signal works by Pollock and Motherwell and introduced a little-known cache of Fluxus paintings by George Brecht and George Machunas, alongside the conceptual painterly gestures of Yoko Ono and Mieko Shiomi, all analyzed as radically transformed extensions of high modernist impulses. More to the point, my education in contemporary painting has come mainly through my practice as a critic, indeed reviewing exhibitions of the work of artists who readily identify as painters, but also artists who make objects that behave like paintings and or utilize painting alongside other tactics in a broader project-based, research-driven practice. Best of all, this education has also come through friendships with certain painters who've proven to me that important paintings continue to be made and in fact need to be made in this specific time and geography. I'm using this opportunity to come to closer terms with Texas art history and with Texas painting, or if such a category cannot be said to exist, with painting that happens to be made in Texas. It seems that many of you all are as well. Is Texas painting? What does it mean to be a painter in Texas now? We owe answers to these questions to ourselves. And barring that, we owe answers to these questions to our students, who increasingly seem to want to refasten painting to its history in Texas, as the description of this symposium would have it. I would further argue that the shifting, deterritorializing landscape of global contemporary art demands it, as does recognition of Texas's standing within the United States on multiple levels, demographically, politically, economically, ecologically, and culturally. For example, as sociologist Stephen Kleinberg lays out in his recent book, Prophetic City, Houston on the Cusp of a Changing America, the demographics of the city of Houston currently reflect what will be the makeup of the entire country in a few decades' time. Tracy Thompson's 2014 book, The New Mind of the South, which is an update on J.W. Cash's 1941 classic, makes a similar argument for the South in general, which in her account includes the largest Texas metro areas of Houston and Dallas-Fort Worth. Taking into account also the 2020 census, Texas had the largest jump in population of any state since 2010, and this was almost entirely driven by an increase in Texans of color. Texas will be the only state to gain an additional 2 congressional seats, and very soon, Latinos will make up our largest demographic bloc. In short, we are already living what American culture at large is soon to become. And this seems to me a good and important thing, something to think concertedly about, to name and seize upon in and through our respective practices. We are living in a version of the nation's future, and we have the honor and responsibility to telegraph that experience to others. Those of us residing along the Gulf Coast and the southern border are on the front lines of the most dramatic effects of climate change and immigration policies, and can bear witness to that experience. At the state level, partisan political battles reflective of broader national debates play out in their most extreme versions. As Thompson argues, these represent the last power grabs of a hard right party losing its footing. Sometimes it's hard to believe that, given the heinous package of laws that were put on the books in Texas this week. But the demographers' predictions are not wrong, even if they are painfully slow in playing out. The future of this state cannot arrive soon enough. Nevertheless, the outcomes of these partisan battles land on the doorsteps of our homes and classrooms, where we are afforded the opportunity to shape the critical thinking and critical making skills of future generations. Since moving to Texas, I, for one, have felt that my actions, whether as a scholar, a critic, or a citizen, have become more politically and culturally consequential and admittedly fraught than they ever were or could have been when I was living in LA. This seems to me also a good and important thing. Maybe Texas is not the perfect place to be, but it is undeniably a truly important one. In the rest of my time this morning, I will try to do a few things. I will offer some historically informed answers to the question, who is a Texas artist? And I will approach this through presenting a series of highlights from the history of exhibiting Texas art in this state across the 20th century, with an emphasis on Houston, where I live, and on the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, which plays an outsized role in this history as the first art museum to open in Texas in 1924. Because the emergence of modern art in Texas was channeled mainly through the medium of painting, this is also more or less the history of Texas painting. I'm interested in tracking the different answers to the question of who is a Texas painter over time. In other words, I'm interested in the historiography of this question. I'm interested in what different art world agents over the course of the last 100 or so years have thought about the regionalism question. How have artists navigated their identification with Texas? How have institutions helped shape our notion of what constitutes Texas painting? When did we lose faith in a thing called Texas painting? Is the idea worth saving? And if so, why? What I provide here will be a general sketch. I fully trust and honor that many of you know this history much better than I do, but I will try to make a contribution by offering some framing hermeneutics based on recent art historical scholarship for rethinking what it means to be working as an artist in Texas. And before I get into this history, I want to take a moment and acknowledge a couple major pieces of scholarship that already tell this history quite well, and with beautiful illustrations, I might add. So if you've ever heard the complaint that the history of modern and contemporary art in Texas is understudied, you should know that while, yes, there is much work to be done, there are incredible resources already out there, and these are some of them. The first is MFAH curator Allison DeLima Green's exhibition catalog from the year 2000, Texas, 150 works from the MFAH. This is a book-length history of 20th century art in Texas built around objects from the museum's collection, and with an introduction that also tells the story of modernism's arrival to Texas in the early decades of the century. For a mid-century history, I'd recommend Katie Robinson Edwards's 2014 scholarly book, Mid-Century Modern Art in Texas, which focuses mainly on the 1930s to the 1960s with a heavy emphasis on painting. And also Pete Gershon's book, Collision, the Contemporary Art Scene in Houston, which zooms in on a very vibrant decade of art practice in Houston and highlights dozens of major players and contends with their struggles to grab national attention. Additionally, the many exhibition catalogs and essays of Susie Khalil offer both syncretic overviews and deep dives into particular artists. And there's, of course, her Fresh Paint catalog, but she also produced an impressive monograph on Dorothy Hood, among other Texas artists. And I found a catalog of hers from 1986 called The Texas Landscape, incredibly useful as well. So we might begin with Julian Underdonk, considered the father of Texas painting, who worked in the first decades of the 20th century at a moment when Texas painting was first being identified and celebrated. An artist from San Antonio, an impressionist landscape painter who studied in New York with William Merritt Chase before returning to Texas. His work really establishes a definition of Texas painting that is rooted in a connection to the land, and a catalog raisonné that was released recently in 2016 cemented his reputation as the origin figure for modern Texas painting. In 1924, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston is founded with a mission to cultivate the artistic sensibilities of Houstonians, but also to cultivate local artists. This was part of its original mission. And interesting to me is that there was a very gendered construct to this. The origins of the art scene in Houston were really driven by ambitious women, creative white women in particular, who were building social and cultural infrastructure, admittedly in their image, in parallel to their wealthy elite male partners who, for their part, were building up the economic and political infrastructure of the city. And this period also inaugurates a time in which Texas painters are working through a common array of subject matter, but figured through competing aesthetic visions. In the late 1920s, the San Antonio Art League organizes traveling art exhibitions and competitions that legislate certain categories, such as Texas wildflowers, Texas ranch life, and Texas cotton fields. And there are also annual exhibitions and competitions of Texas art that involve prizes and collection building. For example, the Texas General Exhibition, which was established in 1940, and is held annually from 1940 until 1961, and travels between Dallas, Houston, and San Antonio. Houston also has its own annual art competition. And then by the 30s, we enter a period commonly known as Lone Star Regionalism. And throughout this period, I was kind of surprised to learn that in the long tail of the Civil War, Texas as a state was actively rebranding itself as a Western state rather than a Southern one, as its economy recentered around ranching and oil rather than agrarian pursuits like cotton. And so historians have shown that the iconic image of the Texas cowboy is actually entirely a 20th century invention. And this is a period in which modern and contemporary painting in Texas organizes very quickly around particular urban centers, Dallas, Houston, Austin, etc., rather than having a kind of cohesive regionalism that spans the entire state. So I would identify this period as the emergence of Texas regionalisms in plural, which include probably most famously the Dallas Nine, with folks like Jerry Bywaters and Everett Spruce, who are most well known from this period. They're influenced by Thomas Hart Benton and Diego Rivera. Bywaters, for one, visits Rivera in Mexico. This version of regionalism is wrought through subject matter that registers as Texan, even if many of these artists are just beginning to push at the limits of conventional notions of Texas art. So this is a period that I see in which we can think of Texas painting as being honed, taught, and institutionalized. To my mind, the most powerfully relevant bodies of work to emerge from this period are those of John Biggers. From his large-scale murals to his intimate works on paper, his is a regionalism that privileges figures rendered in a knowing and sensitive way. Trained by the artist Charles White, he comes to establish an art program at TSU in Houston. The contemporary interest, but when I say contemporary here, I mean in our time, interest in figurative paintings that center figures of color, not just individual subjects, but the intimate particularities of one's personal and social context, require a revisitation or a recalibration of Texas art history that better highlights work like that of John Biggers. Additionally, there have been recent efforts to restore some of Biggers's murals in Houston that were damaged by Hurricane Harvey, including the one that I'm showing you at the bottom. This resonates for me as well with the recent restoration of a major outdoor mural from the 1970s located in Houston's Second Ward by the Chicano artist Leo Tanguma. So now is like the perfect time to be revisiting these major figures. Moving into the 1940s, the story of Texas painting is kind of pushed forward by Robert Preusser and Tony LaSalle, both of whom studied with Moholy-Nagy at the New Bauhaus in Chicago. Preusser's 1940 work, the one that you see in the middle of my screen, was included in the 16th annual Houston Artists Exhibition. So if Underdonk is considered the father of Texas painting, we might regard Preusser as the first Texas modernist. His 1940 painting was indeed the first abstract painting to enter the collection of the MFAH through one of their annual competitions. And I was pleased to see that it recently went up on view in the Kinder building at the MFAH. So you can go see it, although it's tucked away in the prints and drawings section because it's a painting on paper. Equally interesting, the work of Tony LaSalle, like many artists, modern artists in this moment, moving through Texas as a teacher, and kind of supporting one's practice as a teacher. Interestingly, in the 1947 Texas General Exhibition catalog, then director of the MFAH, James Chilman, writes, "Gone are the sentimental bluebonnets, gone the pale magnolias, gone the nostalgic bits of Southern landscape, and in their places is a modern statement of modern times." So abstract modernism coming to Texas in the 40s. Of course, alongside the arrival of John and Dominique Demonil, they moved to Houston from France in the early 40s, and they slowly begin to collect modern art and embark on a project of ambitious institution building. They collaborate with the University of St. Thomas and with Rice University before finally splitting off on their own. They bring major artists to Houston for exhibitions, including Magritte, who you see on the left, wearing a cowboy hat next to Dominique. as well as Duchamp and Warhol. And they're also importing curatorial talent, most famously Jermaine McHagee from San Francisco. Under their encouragement, even the American Federation for the Arts annual conference comes to Houston in 1957. And this is where Marcel Duchamp delivers his famous Creative Act lecture. This is a period also in which the campus of the MFAH expands with the addition of two Mies van der Rohe designed buildings, first Cullinan Hall in 1958 and the Brown Pavilion in 1974. So architecturally, the museum finally becomes modern, and we are seeing another sort of 21st century global contemporary art version of the museum architecturally writing itself with the opening of the Kinder building. In 1961, the Cosmopolitan curator James Johnson Sweeney becomes the director of the MFAH. He had been a curator at MoMA and then director of the Guggenheim. And one of his first gestures is to eliminate both the Texas and the Houston annual exhibitions as part of his bid to make Houston a more worldly city. The upshot of this is basically the museum turning its back on local artists. However, in some of his writings, he said, in a world where communications have cut down time and distance, regional art is fast disappearing. An international style in painting, sculpture, and architecture is practically inevitable. And yet at the same time, he also acknowledged that this kind of encroachment of conformity through an international style could be a bad thing, and that art scenes ought to protect their regional spice. These are his words, regional spice, and I'll come back to that later, as a measure of individualism or freedom, which strikes me as a kind of Cold War language. James Johnson Sweeney stays only until 1967, owing to clashes with the board over his acquisition of a suite of kinetic sculptures by Jean Tinguely. And tellingly, the MFAH didn't even have a curator directly responsible for 20th century art until 1971. So by the late 1960s, Sweeney is gone, but of course the Manils are still there, and their aesthetic disposition continues to make its mark. And it's at this point we arrive to the figures of Forrest Fess and Dorothy Hood. When I was doing research in advance of this presentation, I was stopped in my tracks on this page from the Fresh Paint catalog, which to me jumped out as a kind of depiction of the id and the superego of Texas painting, if you will. On the one hand, we have Forrest Fess, the shrimper, kind of macho artist, untrained, sort of understood as being close to the land and visionary, evincing a kind of visionary primitivism. And on the other hand, we have Dorothy Hood, who lives off and on in Mexico in the middle decades of the 20th century. She's able to access the kind of near at hand exotic culture and landscape of Mexico. And this affords her work a kind of air of cosmopolitan bohemianism, almost wild, but ultimately has this high quality, high modernist quality of restraint. So this sort of very refined, elegant, astute version of a kind of Texas primitivism or spiritualism. So these are different forms of a kind of Texas primitivism, one refined, the other visionary, but both, of course, highly acceptable within prevailing notions of modernism at the time. Forrest Fess does appear in the Kinder buildings, new installations of their collection between Siqueiros and Jackson Pollock. You see the two canvases there. We, of course, also encounter Rauschenberg in the collections at the Kinder as a kind of representative of Texas art. And Dorothy Hood is there as well, but she is by herself and she is on your way to the bathroom. On the other side of that wall where the Dorothy Hood painting currently hangs is this room that you see on the left, with Joan Mitchell and Jasper Johns, Alice Neal, and so on and so forth. So Rauschenberg gets pride of place here. And Dorothy Hood is kind of still pushed off into the margins. Another piece of scholarship that I thought was a really interesting and informative take on how we understand Texas painting historiographically is an essay by Melissa Mednikoff, and it's called Questions of Texas, Avant-Garde and Outlier. And she talks about how in the history of Texas art, Rauschenberg is of course framed as this avant-garde artist, whereas Fess is framed as a kind of outsider. She writes, Fess and Rauschenberg seem to occupy a space within Texas when it suits the art historian. Connections to Texas within their work alternately become a tool for either camouflaging or expressing Texas, for representing them as either a geographic anomaly or an outlier. So she's basically pointing to the fact that, already, in the mid 20th century, the notion of a Texas painter is a term that's sort of deployed like when it's useful, and it can be repressed when it needs to be or wants to be. So of course, the major moment of that marks the 1980s in the history of Texas painting is the Fresh Paint exhibition curated by Barbara Rose, and the catalog includes an essay by Susie Khalil that opens at the MFAH. And now Dr. Chua will talk about this exhibition in much more detail, so I won't really go into it here. But I'm interested in like all the things that are happening in the 80s to solidify this notion of Texas painting and Texas art. In 1986, Susie Khalil opens an exhibition of Texas landscape painting going back to 1900, and that is actually the museum's first historical survey of Texas art, 1986. Also in this period, the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art launched the Texas Artist Project, a project to archive Texas art since 1875. And this is a moment too when Texas artists are kind of coming to terms with their own history. I was interested to learn that it was in fact the painter Terrell James who was responsible for collating the Forrest Fess archive that was part of that Smithsonian project. As in prior decades, notions of Texas art and the institutional focus are still dominated by painting. So among contemporary painters, like those included in Fresh Paint, expressive figuration is dominant. On the other hand, major institutions like the MFAH remain enthralled to large-scale color field painting. Here you're seeing an installation view of the very first exhibition to occupy the Brown Pavilion of the MFAH when it opened in 1974. By this point in history, it becomes clear that any notion of a Texas painter is driven by the larger art ecosystem's drive for power and recognition. It is a term mainly used by dealers, collectors, and curators rather than artists. And yet it is also one that is conventionally cast off as soon as an artist has gained a national or international reputation, and their associations with Texas may be demoted within their career trajectory as a kind of minor episode. One thinks here of folks like Julian Schnabel or Derek Boscher, who for a long time I didn't even realize had connections to Texas. But it can apply to artists in earlier moments. I think Rauschenberg is a good example. But this is also a period in which some artists are reclaimed as Texan. So in 1998, there's a major retrospective of Rauschenberg that is held across the MFAH, the CAM, the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, and the Menil Collection, which opens its campus in 1987. And the Menil Collection's surrealist-infused array of objects further ensconces a notion of a kind of primitivist spiritualism as the core of modernism and, by extension, Texas art. Arguably, this further elevates painters like Dorothy Hood and Forrest Fess over other modes of painting in Texas, like those celebrated in Fresh Paint. There's also, I would observe, a kind of new meta-consciousness about Texas art in this moment of the 80s and 90s. Long-standing Texan stereotypes have been transformed by several generations of artists, into valued tropes that continue in the work through personal politics or a kind of critical, ironic engagement. In this way, modern and contemporary Texas art history becomes more firmly institutionalized around the very same time that the very category of Texas artist begins to destabilize. As Alison de Lima Green observes in her catalog, for artists, the dialectics of regionalism and representation held little meaning. I also want to observe that this is a period when the core program is established, 1982, and Art Pace as a residency is established in the early 90s. So more artists are moving through the state. They come and go. Sometimes they stick. And as in earlier periods in Texas art history, activities are centered around universities alongside residencies. This is a reason why people come to Texas, or they come back to Texas, or maybe they come here for the first time and they stay. So in the 90s and into the 2000s, we still see exhibitions that attempt to survey Texas art or Texas painting. Texas exhibitions persist, but I would say they argue unconvincing theses. There is a kind of lack of coherence, and painting loses its privileged position within notions of contemporary art in Texas. The CAM opens an exhibition in 2007 called Nexus Texas, which includes a short essay by Toby Camps, where he makes the arguments that, number one, Texas is a good place to be an artist. 2, Texas is a good place for art. 3, Texas is a good subject for artists. 4, Texas is a good place to have a studio. And 5, Texas is a good place to be in the world. Notably, the way this exhibition is conceived, the terms of Texas artist have by that point been split apart. So Texas is no longer an adjective that describes an artist. It is rather a place where some artists happen to work. So as I'm sure you know, the MFAH opened its new Kinder building last year, dedicated to showcasing the museum's collection of international modern and contemporary art. And so in addition to surveying the existing literature on Texas painting, it seemed to me that an equally good place to start, maybe even a better place to start, would be in the galleries of the Kinder. Which other Texas painters have made it into the MFAH's story of modern and contemporary art? I wanted to know. But I did enter through the gift shop because I wanted to see literally what the museum was selling in terms of a vision of Texas art and Texas painting. So on the left, you can see their postcard rack. There's a whole, almost an entire line of Julian Underdonk postcards. And then you also see some Frederick Remington magnets. He's not a Texas artist, but I think often mistakenly characterized as a Texas artist in this kind of classic notion of a the Western kind of Western culture and aesthetics that we know is a kind of modern construction. Also Rauschenberg, a whole half of a table devoted to Rauschenberg. And I was pleased to see these beautiful postcards of works by John Biggers. The drawing on the left was a piece that was included in the first installation at the Kinder building when it first opened. But in my last visit, I saw that they had taken it down, and I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that this is probably a work on paper that can't be up for very long. There is a Biggers sculpture in its place at the moment. So we've already seen Underdonk, Biggers, Prusers in the galleries, Fess, Hood, and Rauschenberg in the galleries and the gift shop, but who else is there? There's a gallery under the thematic of border mapping and witness, which is one of my favorite galleries that they've put together, which includes the El Paso artist James Drake, this work that you see on the bottom left, and a painting by Cesar Augusto Martinez, a San Antonio artist. This painting looks incredibly contemporary to me. These are works from the 80s. I was also really interested to see this pairing of an OK Mountain work on paper next to a piece by the art guys. This seemed to me a kind of, baby steps towards thinking about Texas art historically, that there is a kind of continuum between the art guys and OK Mountain that is being implied here, a kind of generational handing off of the baton. In that same gallery, we see this painting by Rachel Hecker, a Houston artist, next to a suite of works by Yoshitomo Nara, so a way of framing a Texas painter within an international context. The work to Hecker's left, I believe, is a painting by Arturo Herrera. We also see this work by Jeff Elrod, originally from Dallas, but it's not with the paintings. It is hung above a chair in the design, the craft and design gallery. And it was at this point in my sojourn that I began to wonder, like, where is the expressive figuration? Where are the artists that we would associate with the moment of fresh paint, the artists who really were dominating the scene, at least in Houston, in the 70s and 80s? I do not see that registering within the MFAH's current history of Texas painting. It's as if fresh paint never happened. We also see this poignant work by Vincent Valdez from San Antonio, now based in Houston, that is situated between a Kara Walker and some sculptures by Melvin Edwards, who I should note is also a Texas artist. In a gallery that includes a number of works that reference pop culture, we see this painting on paper by Daolu Jabari Anderson, who some of you may know as part of the collaborative Otobenga Jones and Associates, which of course raises the question of where is Trenton Doyle Hancock, where is Michael Ray Charles? Well, of course, Hancock is there in the museum, but he's in the restaurant. He was invited, he was commissioned to make a large-scale work that would remain, as far as I understand, on permanent installation in the museum. So this is a tapestry. It's a monumental tapestry that hangs in the restaurant. It's called Color Flash for Chat and Chew, Paris, Texas in '72. We also find this large-scale painting, The Red and White by Rick Lowe, based in Houston, hung across the way from a piece by Sam Gillian. And in the prints and drawings area, I also was surprised to see this work by Jason Moran, who we know as a Houstonian, but mainly as a jazz pianist. It's a piece where he laid paper across on top of piano keys and had kind of dry pigment on his hands and then played the piano. And it's a kind of, John Cagean, Robert Rauschenbergian play of chance and mark making, I would say. But I think it's interesting to see both of these figures entering the museum's narrative of Texas art and Texas painting so quickly. They are, I would say, recent painters whose reputations are built on accomplishments outside the realm of painting. Although, of course, Rick Lowe was trained as a painter, and yet he hasn't been showing work as such for many years, and his reputation is mainly built on his very important work at Project Row Houses. So at this point, I was sort of led to think about who are the people that I would have liked to see in these galleries, or who I think would fill in some of the gaps in the version of Texas painting that is on view right now. I would have liked to see this Melissa Miller painting that is in the museum's collection, or this work on the top right by Kristen Musnung, who's had a brief sojourn through Houston as a core fellow, as well as the work of Houston-based painter Julie DeVries. All of these artists really figuring in incredibly beautiful painterly ways the traumas of climate change and thinking about our relationship to other more than human entities. I would have also liked to have seen Dana Frankfurt or Stephen Laptisapone or Floyd Newsom. Newsom in particular to me is a Texas painter whose work is looking incredibly fresh in consideration of some of the more painting practices that reference like earlier moments in the history of graphic design. I would have also liked to have seen works by Virginia Jaramillo, who the Manil has recently highlighted, or Donna Huanca, who has recently had work at Ballroom Marfa, or Terrell James. I would have liked to have seen El Franco Lee too, or Jasmine Zelaya. These are younger artists based in Houston, but I think very much their work for me very much resonates with what I'm seeing across the larger landscape of contemporary painting in the United States. And I was happy to see that both of these artists are included in the Texas biennial that is just opening up this week between Houston and San Antonio. So if I said before that the notion of Texas as a Western state is a relatively recent invention, I would argue today that the pendulum is swinging back towards Texas's cultural reintegration with the South in terms of both the southern United States and the areas south of the US-Mexico border. Through the curatorial efforts of figures including Alvia Wardlaw and Valerie Chiselle Oliver, and with recent institutional transformations, such as that at the Contemporary Arts Museum Houston, Texas continues to build on its reputation as an important center of Black creativity. As such, Black visual artists working here have gained a visibility that in some ways parallels that of pop culture figures also associated with Texas, whose output is valued precisely because of that association. With an increasing attention as well to the work of Latinx artists working in and through Texas, one might very well claim that now is a time of decolonizing the very notion of a Texas artist. Toward that end, artist Julia Barbosa Landois has established the website mantecahtx.com, a registry of Latinx artists working in the greater Houston area, but which may expand to include more of the state. And pointing towards other ways of reconsidering Texas art, the 2021 Texas Biennial opens this week with exhibition sites in Houston and San Antonio. I hope some of you get a chance to see it. This is curated by Ryan Dennis and Evan Garza, who recently moved away from Houston to take up new positions in Mississippi and Washington, D.C., respectively. Notably, Dennis and Garza have adopted a very expansive definition of Texas artist for their biennial. As their press release says, in addition to artists living and working in Texas, the biennial curators have broadened the scope of the project to include Texpats, i.e. Texas natives and artists with deep connections to the Lone Star State, working in any part of the world. I also want to recognize the efforts of the collective of curators and arts professionals behind the new artist interview initiative, Texas Talks Art, which exploits multiple accessible platforms, YouTube, Instagram, to elevate the work of both Texas artists and Texas curators. And I think it promises to be a very important archive of our time. So as for framing all of the above, I think that returning to past debates on provincialism is one way to think about today's questions. In a 1974 essay in Art Forum on the provincialism problem, critic Terry Smith noted conflicting drives in periphery cities to celebrate localism while also seeking external validation. This may be his only claim made in that piece that holds today. Smith's argument that artistic models from the center are received in the peripheries in poor reproduction and divorced from their context has been obviated by Instagram and cheap flights. Moreover, migration of cultural information is no longer one way from center to periphery. It cuts both ways. We now have biennials and triennials in New Orleans, Cleveland, Portland, and off and on again, Texas. Woe be the next Whitney Biennial curator who would dare not to conduct studio visits in the United States' second largest and most populous state. Moreover, as artists who frequently exhibit their work in artistic centers live and work elsewhere by choice or by financial force, curators in the centers are looking increasingly to the peripheries. If Lucy Lepard, during a 1976 tour of the Pacific Northwest, observed that you don't have to live in the Big Apple to be an artist, only to be known as an artist, that is simply no longer true. In effect, we have returned to the conditions of pre-war America, in which, as Donald Cuspit has written, there were to be no privileged places in which art would be practiced. It was un-American to suppose that any American place would offer better conditions for the making of art than any other. Terry Smith's article on the provincialism problem concluded with the ironically optimistic statement that most of us are provincial artists. Now I think, in our battles for sustainability and against the forces of precarity, provincial artists are what many of us are destined to be. I also want to acknowledge Michelle Grobner's 2016 Portland Biennial Catalog, which included a number of meditations on provincialism and regionalism. And I was also thinking about the recent efforts of the Getty Foundation to support Pacific Standard Time, to pay attention to the history of art in California, or the Terra Foundation funded series of exhibitions and publications focused on the city of Chicago. We need work like that here in Houston. Now, I want to sort of begin to close my remarks by triangulating the thoughts of three different scholars who, for me, offer an updated way of thinking about the regionalism or provincialism problem in 21st century terms. The first is Mi-Wan Kwan and her 2000 essay, The Wrong Place, which was an early version of the conclusion of her book, One Place After Another, where she observes that the contemporary art world rewards the nomadic professional who shuttles from one art center to the next, chasing opportunity. To be a 21st century subject is to be always on the move, always in the wrong place, never having quite arrived in the right place. Whether we enjoy it or not, she writes, we are culturally and economically rewarded for enduring the wrong place. It seems we are out of place all too often. But what is a wrong place, she continues? How does one recognize it as such, as opposed to a right place? Kwan notices that embracing the so-called lure of the local, as Lucy Lepard put it, is often held up as a means of contesting the homogenization of culture or protecting the regional spice, as Sweeney had put it. But this, she points out, is to ignore the fact that the production of difference itself is a prime operation of capitalism. She writes, one might go so far as to say that this desire for difference, authenticity, and our willingness to pay high prices for it, literally, only highlights the degree to which they are already lost to us, thus the power they have over us. A lesson to be drawn here, she continues, is that an encounter with a wrong place is likely to expose the instability of the right place, and by extension, the instability of the self. What does this mean for art? Well, for Kwan, it enables a reframing of avant-garde practices in terms of a spatial politics in which art can be most transformative and radical when and where it puts itself in places where it does not belong, where it puts itself in the wrong place. The other piece of Kwan's writing that is relevant here is a 2009 essay that responds to an exhibition of so-called Korean contemporary art mounted at LACMA. She criticizes the way that the nation-focused display takes for granted the very category of Korean contemporary art as a way of making collective sense of these artists' practices, without interrogating the very premise of that term or taking stock of its instability. She observes that the Korean identity of these artists seemed more like an accident of birth than a viable organizing principle for a show, as most of them had left Korea for graduate training in the major art centers of Europe and the US, which underscores the contemporary reality that the role or identity of the artist today, as Kwan observes, is invested with the presumption of transcending location, national identification, and cultural specificity, a process that is seemingly hampered if you are linked to a particular place or tradition. She continues, I think it is undeniable that at a historical moment of geography-defying coordination of markets and economies, as well as boundary-defying technologies of communication, exchange, and contact, the meaning of being from a particular somewhere could have a different significance than before. What could this difference be? This is precisely the question taken up by David Josselit's recent book, Heritage and Debt, Art and Globalization, which concerns itself with how the specific cultural identities and material signifiers of internationally known contemporary artists circulate within the global art market. His study is a kind of systems theory for global contemporary art that approaches numerous layers and players of an international network: artists, curators, collectors, institutions, and markets. Josselit tracks the ways in which regional signifiers, especially those utilized by artists from outside the West, become a form of cultural capital that infuses an otherwise quite generic and homogeneous international style of contemporary art with specific value that can be commodified. In essence, artists who were once excluded from the modernist narrative because their work did not speak its aesthetic language are now being invited in and celebrated precisely because the marks of difference in their work make it a desirable commodity within the matrix of global contemporary art. This is, of course, an effect of one of the prime operations of capitalism, as Kwan had observed, the production of difference itself. But for Josselit, this may not be a bad thing at all. He sees the revaluation of regional spice, to borrow Sweeney's phrase again, as a means for artists from the so-called peripheries to force central power players to participate in a project of cognitive justice, in which earlier hierarchies around culture, knowledge, and aesthetics are overturned, and we are forced to account for local narratives and epistemologies that are attached to these formerly outsider artworks that we now want to see in our galleries. In other words, in the wake of ongoing processes of contemporary art's pluralization and globalization, categories such as contemporary versus traditional or center versus periphery have been exposed as contingent and shifting. Josselit writes, fundamental to globalization, then, is a highly consequential cultural recalibration. The West regains its heritage as a particular rather than universal set of traditions, while the global South reasserts its dynamic traditions as contemporary, not belated, outmoded, or irrelevantly vernacular or particular, I might add. So what does this have to do with art in Texas? Well, it seems to me that the frameworks of the discourse on global contemporary art, particularly engagements with the question of global versus local, actually map just as well onto intranational national maps as they do onto international maps. So that today we are better able to see the art scenes of New York and LA as provincial in their own ways, while also revaluing the work of artists based in the peripheries or semi-peripheries as particularly valuable to the project of building a holistic picture of cultural production in this country. And I'm reaching my last few slides, I promise. And this leads me to the last scholar whose work I want to highlight, who is Jacob Stewart Halvey, who recently published a book on Bay Area funk art. And I don't have time to go into much detail, but it's a fascinating read. And while at first glance it may not seem very relevant to us here, there are in fact striking parallels between what he observes of the semi-peripheral Bay Area scene of the 60s and 70s and what we ongoingly experience here in Texas, beyond the simple fact that Texas did have its own parallel funk art movement. Like Josselit, Stewart Halvey takes a systems approach to looking at the activities of artists, curators, and critics of that region and time period, which he characterizes after the sociologist and political economist Emanuel Wallerstein as a semi-periphery, not totally peripheral, but not the center either. Stewart Halvey tracks the various strategies and moves of his subjects as they attempt to grab attention from the centers while also protecting the integrity of their semi-peripheral scene. So by way of provisional conclusion, I wanted to share some kind of in-progress studio shots from my colleague in the painting department here at University of Houston, Rachel Hecker. She was kind enough to share with me this project that she's been working on during the pandemic. If the pandemic has taught us anything, of course, it has taught us the power of digging where we stand, of looking to our near communities as sources of strength, resiliency, and inspiration. And I think this symposium is an important step in that direction, and important for the community of painters who happen to live in Texas. As you can see, Hecker has been experimenting on a very small scale, a micro scale, developing paintings that live in a miniature gallery that she has been playing with in her studio. Instead of looking outward, really looking inward. Coincidentally, I noticed that this very week, the editors of the internationally distributed arts listserv, Art Agenda, published a very relevant editorial that I wanted to share an excerpt from. If we've gleaned anything from the first exhibitions of work made under the lockdowns, it's that prolonged attention to the place in which you are confined can be imaginatively liberating. There is no contradiction here. Gaston Bachelard wrote that a house that has been experienced is not an inert box because inhabited space transcends geometrical space, which is to say that you can expand your intellectual horizons without leaving the apartment, never mind the neighborhood, and that time invested in your environment is never wasted. Taken further, it might also mean that culture, the inhabited space of human histories and ideas, is at once local and translocal, always inflected by the circumstances of its creation, but not delimited by them. The most effective way to access other cultures is not to hop on a plane, but to participate in the one that surrounds you. It remains the case that wherever you are reading this, the space of culture is not elsewhere. It is right outside your window. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Herron. That was fantastic. I regret that I don't think we have time for questions. I'm realizing I've scheduled everything a little bit too tightly. So unfortunately, I think we have to close, but this was truly fantastic. Thank you for your incredible research. And would it be okay to invite people to contact you through email? With
Absolutely,
questions?
absolutely. I apologize that I went long. I started preparing the talk worrying that I wouldn't have enough to say, and I ended up having too much. So I apologize. But thank you for your attention and for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
It's terrific. Thank you so much.